The last train left Jane Ashcombe at a deserted seaside station long after sunset. Fog drifted across the empty platform while distant waves crashed somewhere. Below the cliffs, a single black carriage waited beneath the gas lamps, its driver silent beneath the rain. Jane hesitated before climbing inside. She still did not understand why she had come to Ravensmere House at all. The letters had arrived for weeks without explanation, each written in the same elegant handwriting. You left something important behind. No signature, no address, only those words, appearing wherever she traveled. The carriage moved slowly along the coastline, while the sea appeared and vanished through the mist. At last, iron gates emerged from darkness. Beyond them stood Ravensmere House, enormous and pale above the cliffs, its windows glowing softly against the storm. The estate looked less abandoned than forgotten, like a place waiting too patiently for someone to return. Before Jane could knock, the front doors opened. Warm candlelight spilled across the wet stone entrance. A woman dressed in dark blue silk stood beneath the chandelier. "Miss Ashcombe," she said calmly. "We wondered whether the weather might change your mind." Jane removed her gloves slowly. It nearly did. The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Vale, caretaker of the estate. She led Jane through endless corridors filled with clocks. Grandfather clocks lined the walls beside tiny silver clocks and delicate porcelain ones beneath glass cases. Some ticked softly. Others had stopped at strange hours. None matched each other. The former owner disliked silence, Mrs. Vale explained quietly. Jane noticed every clock seemed slightly too loud inside the empty house. Their uneven ticking followed her through the corridors like nervous breathing. Her room overlooked the dark sea below. Rain struck the tall windows, while the fireplace burned low beside an armchair covered in dust sheets. Near the bed stood a small wooden table, stacked with unopened letters tied carefully in silver ribbon. None carried names or addresses. Jane stepped closer, unsettled by the familiar handwriting across every envelope. A knock interrupted her thoughts. A man stood outside the half-open door holding a candle. He was tall, dark-haired, dressed in black wool, still damp from rain. His expression remained calm, though exhaustion shadowed his eyes. "Forgive the late hour," he said softly. "Mrs. Vale asked me to see whether you arrived safely." "You work here?" Jane asked. "Something like that." He gave a faint smile. "Nathaniel Grey." Jane glanced toward the letters. "Beside the fireplace. Do you know who keeps sending those?" For a moment he said nothing. The candlelight flickered across his face, while rain whispered against the windows behind them. "No," he replied at last, though his hesitation answered differently. Then somewhere deep within Ravensmere House, a clock began striking midnight. One by one, every other clock inside the estate answered it. Jane slept only a few hours. All night the clocks inside Ravensmere House ticked with uneven rhythm, some fast, some painfully slow. Several times she woke believing footsteps had stopped outside her door. Yet each time the corridor remained empty, except for trembling candlelight. Near dawn she rose from bed and crossed toward the window. The sea below the cliffs looked gray and endless beneath the storm. Rain moved across the water like smoke. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Mrs. Vale entered, carrying tea on a silver tray. "You should eat something," she said gently. Jane glanced toward the stack of unopened letters beside the fireplace. "Who lived here before?" Mrs. Vale hesitated while pouring tea. "Mr. Everden owned the estate for many years." "And where is he now?" "Gone." The answer arrived too quickly. By afternoon the rain weakened into cold mist. Jane wandered alone through the western wing, following the constant ticking echoing through the manor. Many rooms stood abandoned beneath white sheets and dust. Others looked strangely untouched, as though someone still returned to them each evening. At the end of a narrow corridor, she discovered a locked glass room filled entirely with clocks, Hundreds covered the walls from floor to ceiling. Most had stopped at different hours. Only one continued ticking steadily near the center of the room. 11:23. Most people avoid this corridor. Jane turned suddenly. Nathaniel Grey stood nearby holding a candle. Without the storm around him, he appeared calmer today, though exhaustion still lingered behind his eyes. Jane looked back toward the silent clocks. Why keep them? Nathaniel watched the glass door quietly before answering. Mr. Everden believed memories disappear when people stop measuring time. Jane studied him carefully. You knew him well. Too well. The reply sounded almost accidental. For a moment neither spoke. Somewhere nearby, a clock clicked sharply and stopped ticking. Nathaniel reached into his coat pocket and handed Jane a folded envelope. Her name was written across the front, in the same elegant handwriting as the others upstairs. This arrived an hour ago, he said softly. Jane opened the letter carefully. Inside waited only one sentence. You were happier before you remembered him. A strange heaviness settled inside her chest. Who is him? She asked quietly. Nathaniel lowered his eyes for a moment, avoiding her gaze. Then somewhere deep inside Ravensmere House, every clock suddenly began striking midnight together. The sound of the clocks continued long after midnight. Jane stood alone in her room while candlelight trembled. Across the walls and the sea crashed endlessly below the cliffs. The letter remained in her hands. You were happier before you remembered him. She read the sentence again and again, unsettled by the strange feeling that she should already understand it. Sleep became impossible after that. Near 2 a.m. she left her room carrying a candle and wandered quietly through the corridors of Ravensmere House. The manor felt different at night. The ticking seemed louder. Shadows stretched longer across the walls. Several clocks had stopped completely, their hands frozen at impossible hours. As Jane passed the music room, she noticed light beneath the half-closed door. Someone was awake. Nathaniel sat alone beside the fireplace with a glass of untouched wine resting near his hand. An old gramophone played softly beside him, filling the room with slow piano music worn thin by time. He looked up immediately when Jane entered. You should be asleep, he said quietly. So should you. A faint smile appeared briefly on his face before disappearing again. Jane stepped farther into the room. Shelves filled with records covered the walls, beside stacks of unopened letters, tied in faded ribbon. Does nobody in this house sleep? She asked. Nathaniel glanced toward the gramophone. Not comfortably. Rain whispered softly against the windows. Jane lowered herself into the chair across from him. For several moments neither spoke. The silence between them felt strangely calm rather than awkward. Then Jane finally placed the letter on the table between them. Who keeps sending these? Nathaniel stared at the handwriting without touching the paper. Sometimes people return to places before they remember why they left. That is not an answer. No, he admitted softly. It isn't. The gramophone suddenly crackled. The music slowed unnaturally before stopping altogether. At the exact same moment, every clock inside Ravensmere House fell silent. Jane felt the change immediately. The absence of ticking seemed heavier than the sound itself. Nathaniel slowly rose from his chair. For the first time since arriving, Jane saw genuine unease in his expression. Then, somewhere deep inside the manor, a single door slammed shut. The silence after the clocks stopped felt unnatural. Jane remained motionless beside the fireplace while the gramophone slowly turned without music. Nathaniel crossed the room first, his expression tense in a way she had not seen before. Stay here, he said quietly. Absolutely not. Another sound echoed somewhere upstairs. Not loud. More like cautious movement across old floorboards. Nathaniel hesitated, only briefly before taking the candle from the table and stepping into the corridor. Jane followed, despite his obvious irritation. The western wing looked different without the ticking. The manor no longer felt restless. It felt watchful. Candlelight flickered across portraits and dark wallpaper, while rain whispered, faintly beyond the tall windows. As they reached the staircase, Jane noticed one clock still moving near the entrance hall. Its hands trembled violently, though no sound came from inside it. "Why did they stop?" she whispered. Nathaniel avoided her eyes. "It happens sometimes. That is not normal." "No," he replied softly. "It isn't." They followed the faint sound upstairs until reaching a narrow corridor Jane had not seen before. A single lamp burned near the end beside a half-open door. Nathaniel slowed immediately. This room should be locked. Inside stood a small private study, covered with dust and sea salt carried by the wind. Papers littered the floor beside overturned chairs. Jane stepped carefully farther inside, while candlelight moved across the walls. Every surface was covered with sketches of the same woman. Some charcoal, some unfinished oil paintings. In every portrait, the woman stood near the sea wearing a dark coat, her face turned slightly away as though avoiding the artist completely. Jane felt her chest tighten unexpectedly. "Who is she?" Nathaniel remained silent too long. Then he finally answered. Her name was Clara Everden. Jane turned toward him slowly. Was? Rain struck sharply against the windows. Nathaniel lowered the candle toward an old writing desk near the wall. Resting there beneath dust and broken glass stood a photograph. Jane stepped closer and felt cold move through her entire body. The woman beside Nathaniel in the photograph looked almost exactly like her. Jane could not stop staring at the photograph. The woman beside Nathaniel wore a dark wool coat and held one hand against the sea wind while strands of hair crossed her face. Even the expression felt familiar, distant, thoughtful, slightly sad. "She looks exactly like me," Jane whispered. Nathaniel remained near the doorway, tense and silent. "Not exactly. Who was she?" Candlelight flickered across the scattered portraits while rain continued against the windows. Nathaniel finally stepped closer to the desk. Clara Everden was Mr. Everden's wife. Jane lowered the photograph slowly. "What happened to her?" His jaw tightened slightly before answering. "She disappeared 3 years ago." The words settled heavily inside the room. Jane looked again at the unfinished sketches covering the walls. Every portrait showed Clara differently. Smiling faintly near the cliffs, reading beside a fireplace, standing in corridors filled with clocks. Yet in every image, she seemed distracted by something beyond the frame. And nobody found her. Nathaniel shook his head once. Jane noticed exhaustion in him again, deeper now, mixed with something dangerously close to guilt. "Were you close to her?" she asked quietly. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he crossed toward the window overlooking the sea. "Clara believed Ravensmere House changed people," he said at last. "She thought the longer someone stayed here, the more difficult it became to trust their own memory." Jane felt cold move through her chest. "That sounds absurd, does it?" Nathaniel turned toward her then, his expression unreadable. "You arrived here only 2 days ago. Yet you already receive letters written by someone who should not know you. You hear clocks striking midnight before midnight arrives. And now you find a woman who looks almost exactly like you hidden inside a locked room." Jane wanted to argue, yet unease settled deeper with every word. Near the desk she noticed another object partly hidden beneath loose papers. A leather journal. The cover carried faint silver initials, C.E. Jane reached for it instinctively, but Nathaniel moved suddenly. "Don't?" His voice came sharper than before. The tension between them changed immediately. Jane slowly withdrew her hand. "Why?" Nathaniel stared at the journal for several seconds before answering quietly. "Because Clara wrote about people before they disappeared." The room fell silent, except for the storm outside. Then, somewhere downstairs, a single clock began ticking again. The ticking downstairs continued alone in the silence. Jane stood beside the desk, while Nathaniel kept his eyes fixed on Clara's journal. Candlelight moved across the leather cover, like trembling water. People disappeared, Jane asked quietly. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. Not literally. Then what did you mean? He remained silent for several seconds before answering. Clara believed Ravensmere House altered people slowly. She wrote that guests began forgetting conversations, changing routines, doubting memories they once trusted. Jane folded her arms tightly against the cold. You expect me to believe a house can do that? No, Nathaniel said softly. I expect you to believe loneliness can. The answer unsettled her more than she expected. Rain continued against the windows while the single ticking clock echoed faintly through the corridor below. Jane looked again toward the journal. Why are you afraid of it? Nathaniel finally met her eyes. Because the last weeks before Clara vanished, she stopped writing about herself. Who did she write about? His expression darkened almost imperceptibly. Me. A sharp gust of wind rattled the glass. Jane stepped toward the desk before he could stop her this time. She opened the journal carefully. Most pages were filled with elegant handwriting faded by age and sea air. At first the entries seemed ordinary. Descriptions of storms, empty dinners, long nights beside the gramophone. Then the writing changed. The lines became uneven. Certain words repeated. Constantly. Clock's silence. Nathaniel. Jane turned another page. Her breath caught immediately. A sketch stared back at her from the paper. Not Clara. Jane herself. The drawing showed her standing beside the cliffs in the same dark coat she wore the night she arrived. Beneath the sketch, Clara had written a single sentence. She returned exactly as I remembered. Jane slowly lowered the journal. This is impossible. Nathaniel looked genuinely shaken now. You were never meant to see that. How could she draw me 3 years ago? He gave no answer. The silence between them grew unbearable. Then, suddenly, the gramophone downstairs began playing by itself. Faint piano music drifted upward through the dark corridors of Ravensmere House. The piano music drifted through the manor slowly, distant and distorted by the storm outside. Jane closed Clara's journal immediately. Someone is downstairs. Nathaniel remained perfectly still beside the desk. His face had lost all color. That gramophone has not worked in months, he said quietly. Another crackling note echoed upward through the corridor. Jane could suddenly smell smoke from the fireplaces below, mixed with the sharp scent of rain carried through old windows. Without waiting, she stepped into the hallway and followed the music downstairs. Nathaniel caught her wrist near the staircase. Jane, his voice lowered carefully. There are certain things in this house you should leave alone. She looked at his hand around her wrist before meeting his eyes again. Then stop hiding things from me. For a moment, neither moved. The tension between them felt heavier than the silence surrounding the manor. Nathaniel released her slowly. Together they descended toward the music room. Candlelight flickered across the dark walls, while shadows moved with every step. The gramophone still played when they entered. An old piano recording filled the room with soft, uneven melody. Yet nobody stood near it. Jane approached carefully. The record turning beneath the needle looked badly scratched with age. Beside it rested a small silver key. Was this here before? She asked. Nathaniel shook his head once. Jane picked up the key slowly. A number had been engraved into the metal. 23, the same hour shown by the only working clock. Inside the glass room upstairs, her chest tightened uneasily. Then she noticed something else. One of the shelves beside the gramophone stood partially open. Hidden behind several records waited a narrow wooden door she had not seen before. Nathaniel saw it at the same moment she did. That shouldn't exist, he whispered. The words barely left his mouth before the piano music stopped abruptly. Silence crashed over the room again. Jane stepped closer to the hidden door. Cold air moved through the narrow gap, carrying the scent of sea salt and damp paper. Nathaniel looked genuinely unsettled now. "I have lived here for years," he said quietly. "There was never a door." Behind that shelf, Jane slid the silver key into the lock before he could stop her. Somewhere deep inside Ravensmere House, a clock suddenly began ticking faster and faster. The silver key turned slowly inside the hidden lock. For one terrible second, nothing happened. Then the narrow wooden door opened inward with a long strained creak. Cold air rushed from the darkness beyond, carrying the scent of sea salt, damp paper, and extinguished candles. Jane lifted the lantern from the nearby table and stepped forward before Nathaniel could stop her. Behind the hidden door stretched a narrow passage built between the walls of Ravensmere House. The corridor was barely wide enough for one person. Shelves lined both sides from floor to ceiling, filled with hundreds of letters tied carefully in ribbon. Some looked decades old. Others appeared recent. Every envelope carried a name written in the same elegant handwriting. Jane moved slowly through the passage, while the lantern light trembled across faded paper. "What is this place?" she whispered. Nathaniel remained close behind her, visibly unsettled. "I swear to you, I never knew this existed." Jane stopped beside one shelf and pulled a letter free. The envelope carried her own name. Not Miss Ash, simply Jane. Her chest tightened immediately. The seal had already been broken. Inside waited only a single sentence: "You always return before the clocks stop completely." Jane stared at the words, while unease crawled slowly beneath her skin. "Someone has been expecting me for years." Nathaniel said nothing. At the far end of the passage, another door stood partially open. Soft candlelight flickered beyond it. Jane exchanged a quick glance with Nathaniel before crossing carefully toward the room. Inside waited a small private sitting room, untouched by dust or age. A fire burned quietly in the hearth. Tea still rested on the table beside an open book, as though someone had left only moments earlier. But the thing that unsettled Jane most stood beside the window overlooking the sea. A portrait, large enough to dominate the room. Clara Everden stared outward from the canvas wearing a dark green dress, one hand resting beside an antique clock. Yet the face was not entirely Clara's anymore. The artist had slowly painted over certain features. The eyes resembled Jane's now, the mouth, even the expression. Nathaniel stepped beside her, visibly shaken. This portrait used to look different. Jane moved closer to the painting. At the bottom corner, partly hidden beneath fresh layers of paint, someone had written a date. Tomorrow's date. Then the grandfather clock inside the sitting room suddenly began striking midnight. The clock continued, striking long after midnight should have ended. Each slow chime echoed through the hidden sitting room while rain battered the windows overlooking the sea. Jane stood frozen before the portrait, unable to look away from the painted version of herself hidden beneath Clara Everden's face. Nathaniel crossed toward the grandfather clock immediately. "This clock hasn't worked in years," he said under his breath. Yet the pendulum moved steadily now, casting long shadows across the floor. Jane noticed something else then. The hands were turning backward. A cold unease settled inside her chest. "Nathaniel," she whispered. He followed her gaze toward the clock face. For the first time since arriving at Ravensmere House, Jane saw genuine fear in him. The room suddenly felt smaller. The fire burned lower without warning while cold air slipped beneath the hidden door behind them. Jane forced herself to step away from the portrait. Near the fireplace stood another small table covered with letters and unfinished sketches. One drawing immediately caught her attention. It showed the hidden sitting room exactly as it looked now. The clock, the portrait, the open journal beside the chair. But two figures had also been sketched near the window. Jane and Nathaniel. Beneath the drawing, Clara's handwriting appeared once more. They always arrive together. Jane slowly lowered the paper. She knew us. Nathaniel looked exhausted suddenly, as though he had been carrying the same terrible thought for years. "No," he said quietly. "I think she was waiting for us." Silence followed. Only the backward ticking of the clock remained. Jane turned toward him carefully. "You still haven't told me everything." Nathaniel avoided her eyes. "Because I don't fully trust my own memory anymore." The confession hung heavily between them. Rain softened outside, leaving only the distant sound of waves below the cliffs. Jane noticed how tired he looked standing there in candlelight, his hands trembling almost invisibly beside his coat sleeves. "What do you remember?" she asked softly. Nathaniel stared toward the portrait. "I remember Clara disappearing." He paused briefly. "And I remember you being here before that happened." Jane felt the floor shift. Beneath her certainty, "That's impossible." "I know." He finally looked at her then, his expression filled with quiet desperation rather than suspicion. "But every time I look at you, it feels less impossible." Suddenly, footsteps echoed somewhere beyond the hidden passage, slow, careful, not imagined this time. Both of them turned toward the dark doorway as another floorboard creaked in the distance. Someone else was inside the walls of Ravensmere House. The footsteps beyond the hidden passage stopped abruptly. Jane held her breath while Nathaniel moved instinctively in front of her, his attention fixed on the darkness behind the doorway. For several long seconds neither of them spoke. Then a faint sound echoed through the narrow corridor again. Not footsteps this time. Quiet humming, a melody. The same piano recording from the gramophone downstairs. Jane felt cold move slowly through her chest. "Someone is there," she whispered. Nathaniel took the lantern from the table and stepped carefully toward the passage. The flame shook slightly in his hand. Together they crossed the hidden corridor lined with letters while the humming continued. Somewhere ahead, soft and distant beneath the ticking clocks. Yet when they finally reached the music room downstairs, it stood completely empty. The gramophone remained silent beside the fireplace. Only one thing had changed. A fresh envelope rested on the center of the piano keys. Jane approached slowly. Her name had already been written across the front in black ink. Nathaniel watched the room uneasily. "That wasn't here before." Jane opened the envelope carefully. Inside waited a single photograph. Her hands tightened immediately. The image showed Ravensmere House years earlier during winter. Snow covered the cliffs and windows, while several figures stood near the entrance, beneath lantern light. One of them was Clara Everden. Another was Nathaniel, younger but unmistakable. And beside them stood Jane herself. She stared at the photograph in silence. "No," she whispered. "I've never been here before." Nathaniel looked equally shaken now. "Turn it over." Jane slowly flipped the photograph. A sentence had been written across the back. "You asked us not to tell you." The room suddenly felt airless. Jane crossed toward the fireplace, struggling to steady her breathing. Fragments of unfamiliar memories flickered painfully through her mind. Candlelight reflecting across dark hallways. Music drifting through empty rooms. Someone laughing softly beside the sea. Then another memory appeared briefly. Nathaniel, standing beside her, beneath snowfall, holding her hand. Jane closed her eyes immediately. "Something is wrong with me." Nathaniel stepped closer carefully. "Jane." She looked at him then, frightened less by the house now than by herself. "What if I really was here before?" The silence between them answered more honestly than words could. Then the grandfather clock inside the entrance hall struck once. Only once. Nathaniel's expression changed instantly. That clock never strikes. Unless someone opens the front door. Somewhere downstairs. Ravensmere House welcomed another visitor. Nathaniel reached the entrance hall before Jane did. The single strike of the grandfather clock still echoed faintly through Ravensmere House while cold wind moved beneath the front doors. Someone had entered recently. The candles near the staircase flickered violently, disturbed by air that should not have been there. Jane stopped beside the enormous clock. Its hands pointed toward midnight again, though only minutes had passed since the last strike. "Who else lives here?" she whispered. Nathaniel's expression darkened. "Nobody." The answer arrived too quickly. Before Jane could question him further, movement appeared near the far corridor. Mrs. Vale stepped into the candlelight, wearing her dark blue dress and carrying a silver lantern. Yet something about her seemed different. Tonight, paler, tired. "You should both return upstairs," she said softly. "The storm is becoming dangerous." Jane stared at her carefully. "Did someone arrive?" Mrs. Vale hesitated, almost invisibly. "No visitors have entered Ravensmere House tonight." Nathaniel did not seem convinced. His attention remained fixed on the corridor behind her. Then Jane noticed it. Water dripping across the marble floor. A trail of seawater leading deeper into the eastern wing. Mrs. Vale quickly moved the lantern to hide it. Too late. Jane stepped forward immediately. Someone came inside from the cliffs. "Jane," Nathaniel warned quietly. But she was already following the wet footprints through the dark hallway. The eastern wing felt colder than the rest of the manor. Many of the clocks here had stopped entirely. Dust covered the furniture beneath heavy white sheets while rain tapped softly against tall windows overlooking the sea. The footprints ended outside a locked door near the very end of the corridor. Jane touched the brass handle carefully. Cold, recently used. Nathaniel arrived beside her, tense and silent. Mrs. Vale remained several steps behind them, gripping the lantern too tightly. "What room is this?" Jane asked. Neither answered immediately. Then Mrs. Vale finally spoke. "Clara's room." Silence settled heavily around them. Jane looked again at the door while fragments of memory flickered painfully through her thoughts. Laughter behind this very door. Music drifting into the corridor. Nathaniel standing beside a fireplace while someone played piano softly nearby. Her chest tightened. "Open it," she whispered. Mrs. Vale slowly removed a small silver key from her pocket. Her hands trembled visibly now. "Miss Ashcombe," she said quietly, "there are certain memories people survive only because they lose them." Then she unlocked the door. Inside, the piano was already playing. The piano played softly inside Clara's room, not violently or strangely, but carefully, as though someone invisible moved across the keys with familiar hands. Jane stepped inside first. Candlelight revealed a room untouched by time. Dark green curtains framed the windows overlooking the sea. Books rested neatly beside the fireplace. A silver hairbrush still lay upon the vanity table, beside dried roses turned brown with age. Yet no one sat at the piano. The melody continued anyway. Nathaniel entered behind her slowly, his face pale in the warm light. Mrs. Vale remained near the doorway, visibly shaken. "It always happens when the room is opened," she whispered. Jane crossed farther inside. The music stopped immediately. Silence settled over the room so suddenly that Jane could hear the sea below the cliffs again. Then she noticed another sound. Breathing, uneven and quiet. Nathaniel heard it too. His attention shifted toward the far corner near the tall windows. A figure sat there in shadow beside the curtains. Jane felt her chest tighten painfully. A woman slowly lifted her head into the candlelight. Her dark hair had faded with silver at the edges, though her face remained unmistakable. Clara Everden. For several seconds nobody moved. Nathaniel looked as though the air had vanished from the room entirely. "Clara," he whispered. She studied him silently. Before her gaze shifted toward Jane, something fragile and exhausted moved across her expression then. Not surprise. Recognition. "You came back," Clara said softly. Jane could barely breathe. "How do you know me?" Clara looked toward the clocks lining the mantelpiece. Everyone had stopped at the same hour. Because you asked me to forget you. The room fell silent again. Nathaniel stepped closer carefully, disbelief and grief fighting across his face. Everyone thought you disappeared. Clara gave a faint, tired smile. No, I stayed. Jane stared at her, unsettled by the strange familiarity in Clara's voice. Stayed from what? Clara lowered her eyes briefly. From the truth. Rain moved gently against the windows while the fire crackled low beside them. Then Clara looked back toward Jane with visible sadness. You don't remember the accident yet, she said quietly. But you will. At that exact moment, every stopped clock inside Clara's room began ticking again. The ticking of the clocks filled Clara's room again. Soft at first, then louder with every passing second. Jane stood near the fireplace, unable to pull her eyes away from Clara. She looked fragile now beneath the candlelight, thinner than the woman in the portraits, yet strangely calm after years hidden inside. Ravensmere House. Nathaniel remained motionless beside the piano, as though afraid even the smallest movement might cause her to disappear again. There was no accident, he said quietly at last. Clara lowered her gaze. There was. Silence settled heavily across the room. Rain drifted gently against the windows, while the sea roared far below the cliffs. Jane felt an ache building inside her head, fragments of memory pressing harder now. Snow falling across the entrance hall. Nathaniel arguing with someone near the staircase. Clara crying quietly beside the gramophone. Tell me what happened, Jane whispered. Clara looked toward her slowly. You arrived here 3 winters ago. Jane's chest tightened immediately. No, you and Nathaniel came together. Nathaniel closed his eyes briefly, pain crossing his expression. Clara continued softly. You planned to leave Ravensmere House before Christmas. Both of you. Jane turned toward Nathaniel. Why can't I remember any of this? He struggled to answer. Because after the accident, you begged us never to speak about it again. The fire crackled sharply beside them. Clara rose slowly from her chair and crossed toward the mantel where several stopped. Clocks rested beside faded photographs. The storm was terrible that night, she said. You and Nathaniel argued before he followed you onto the cliffs. Jane felt her pulse quicken painfully. Another memory surfaced suddenly. Wet stone beneath her shoes. Wind strong enough to steal breath. Nathaniel shouting her name somewhere behind her. Clara touched one of the silent clocks carefully. You slipped near the edge. Jane covered her mouth instinctively as the memory sharpened further. The sea below. Falling, cold water. Then darkness. Nathaniel stepped closer now, his voice barely steady. You survived, Jane. She stared at him through rising panic. But someone else didn't. The room fell silent, except for the relentless ticking surrounding them. Then Jane noticed something strange. One clock near the fireplace had begun moving backward again. Clara saw it too. Her face paled immediately. No, she whispered. Nathaniel turned sharply toward her. What is it? Clara stepped away from the clock slowly. Genuine fear entering her expression for the first time. Someone remembers the truth before they're supposed to. Clara stepped away from the backward-moving clock as though afraid to touch it again. The ticking inside the room had become uneven now, nervous and hurried, echoing through the walls of Ravensmere House like anxious breathing. Jane pressed one hand against the edge of the piano, struggling against the flood of returning memories. Wet cliffs beneath winter rain. Nathaniel's voice calling after her through the storm. A terrible argument she could no longer fully hear. Who died that night? She asked quietly. No one answered immediately. Mrs. Vale lowered her eyes toward the floor, while Nathaniel stared at the fire burning low inside the hearth. Clara finally spoke. Edmund Everden. Jane looked toward her sharply. Your husband. Clara nodded once. He followed you onto the cliffs after the argument. Fragments returned faster now. Jane remembered Edmund's face suddenly. Elegant, charming, always watching people too carefully. She remembered the discomfort she felt around him. The way he seemed fascinated by fear, loneliness, and memory itself. He wanted to keep everyone here, Clara continued softly. Nathaniel, you Ravensmere House became less a home and more an experiment to him. The room felt colder with every word. Jane remembered the hidden letters, the stopped clocks, the endless attempts to confuse memory and time. The accident wasn't an accident, she whispered. Nathaniel finally stepped toward her. Edmund confronted you near the cliffs. You tried to leave after discovering what he had been doing. Jane turned toward him slowly. What was he doing? Nathaniel hesitated. Clara answered instead. He believed memory could be reshaped through repetition, isolation, and emotional dependence. Jane felt sick suddenly. Clara's expression darkened with old grief. He kept records of conversations, changed clocks deliberately, sent letters to guests after they left Ravensmere House to draw them back. Again, Jane looked around the room, filled with ticking clocks and fading candlelight. The letters were from him. No, Clara said quietly. From you. Silence crashed heavily across the room. Jane stared at her in disbelief. Clara crossed slowly toward the writing desk near the window and opened one of the drawers. Inside rested dozens of unfinished letters in Jane's handwriting. After Edmund died, you blamed yourself, Clara explained softly. You forgot pieces of what happened naturally at first. Then you asked us to help you forget the rest. Face carried visible pain now. You said if you remembered everything, you would never leave Raven House again. Jane felt tears rise unexpectedly as another memory surfaced. Herself sitting beside the gramophone late at night, writing letters she would one day send back to herself. Then the backward ticking clock stopped completely. Every candle inside Clara's room flickered at once. Somewhere below them, the front door of Ravensmere House slowly opened on its own. The front door of Ravensmere House remained open as cold sea wind moved through the corridors, extinguishing several candles downstairs. Jane stood silently beside the piano, while the truth settled slowly inside her like winter rain. The letters, the forgotten memories, the strange feeling of returning somewhere familiar. None of it had been coincidence. She had created the mystery herself. Nathaniel crossed toward her carefully, as though afraid she might disappear again if he moved too quickly. Jane, he said softly, you do not have to stay here anymore. His voice carried none of the distance it once had, only exhaustion and something quieter beneath it. Love, the kind that survives long after anger and grief destroy everything else. Jane looked toward the storm outside Clara's windows. 3 years earlier, she had fallen from the cliffs, believing Edmund death was her fault. Nathaniel had saved her from the sea, but not from the guilt that followed afterward. So together, they buried the truth inside letters, clocks, and forgotten rooms, hoping time itself might eventually soften the memory. Clara approached slowly, her expression gentler now. Edmund spent years trying to control memory, she said quietly. But grief does that far more cruelly than any experiment. The clocks around the room continued ticking steadily now. Not backward, not uneven. Normal at last. Jane glanced toward the unfinished letters resting inside the desk drawer. She suddenly understood why she had written them. Not to trap herself inside Ravensmere House forever, but to eventually lead herself back, once she was strong enough to remember. Rain softened outside as dawn slowly approached beyond the sea cliffs. For the first time since arriving, the manor no longer felt oppressive or watchful, only old, tired, human. Nathaniel stepped beside her near the window. What happens now? Jane remained quiet for a long moment before answering. We leave. The words surprised even her. Clara smiled faintly beside the fireplace. Mrs. Vale. lowered her eyes with visible relief. Somewhere downstairs, the grandfather clock struck 6 slow, peaceful chimes. "Morning," Nathaniel offered Jane his hand carefully, uncertain whether she would take it. This time she did. Together they walked through the silent corridors of Ravensmere House, while dawn light slowly replaced candlelight across the walls. The clocks continued ticking behind them, but softer now, fading gently into the distance like the final notes of an old piano recording. And somewhere within the manor, for the first time in many years, no one waited for the past to return. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed this cozy Victorian mystery, don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, and return for more candlelit secrets, rain-soaked manors, and Gothic romances beside the sea.